Hi students, this is your Professor Emelianchuk and we're on day 26 and we are questioning the assertion that says that euthanasia should not be permitted, right? So before I get into the lecture here, I just wanted to draw your attention to my biomedical ethics book recommendations. I have updated it just today here, and here's what I wanted you to see. Let's see if I can zoom in on this. All right, there we go. It's a little bit bigger. And just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things I added here. Under the definition of death, I added the second book here called Defining the Beginning and End of Life. So this actually will cover some of the embryo topics as well. But this is a great book. I have this on my shelf, and it has just a ton of different essays in it. I wonder if here I can actually find an Amazon link. I don't actually link to Amazon because I'm a little hesitant to support them just by default. I want you to be able to make that choice. But anyway, you can see the table of contents. They have all kinds of cool stuff. You know, you get into like persons as immaterial souls and soul bodies, you know, psychological qualities. Are we human organisms, right? You get into all this really great stuff. Super good stuff. You know, what's the deal with persons? What kind of like metaphysics do they have? You know, you get into like social aspects of persons. You get free will. You know, the beginning of life. Okay, end of life. All this stuff, and all these essays are pretty excellent, right? I do recommend each of them. See how they got like the selection from the white paper that I assigned. So that's a good book, right? If I was going to teach a class on this, that's what I would assign. So check that out if you can. Another book you should check out too is this book called The Troubled Dream of Life. Oops, wait a second. Where am I at here? Oh, I moved on too quickly. Yes, we are in Morality of Euthanasia Practice, right? So I mentioned in the previous lecture this book by Altu Gwande, Aging, Illness, Medicine, and What Matters in the End. So he is okay with permitting like physician-assisted suicide, but he does not think it's the answer to our problems at the end of life. And he's very much interested in developing a view of human life that can flourish even at the end, right? Assisted living is what he's trying to talk about and emphasize rather than assisted dying. It's a really interesting book. I highly recommend it. The Troubled Dream of Life is by Dan Callahan, right? He is not a euthanasia advocate at all. He is against it, and he is trying to also talk about how we can flourish at the end of life as well. So you might think of him as a kind of a complement to Gwande in certain senses. Excellent book, highly recommend it. And then there's this pair of books by Johns Hopkins University Press here. We got The Case Against Assisted Suicide by Foley and Hendine. And it looks like that's got that kind of cover. That's where I got the Cass reading from. And then there's also its complement where you find arguments in favor. So it's going to have a bunch of edited papers in favor of it, right? So I ask you to check that out. And then The End of Life by James Rachels. You know, this was published in 1986. But if you want a full-blown defense of euthanasia, I recommend checking this out. You can actually find this book online for free in a PDF format. It's not a neat PDF. All the chapters are broken up, but you can find it. And I think it's still probably one of the better arguments in favor of euthanasia that I've ever read. So you might want to check that out too, right? Rachel's is certainly was the leader, especially in the 80s, on this stuff. And hardly anybody's really improved upon him. I mean, I had you read a paper by Brock, which I think is a really nice kind of one-volume, one-size-fits-all sort of paper that gets into this issue. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of his argument, I want you to take some time and watch this video about Terry Schiavo. All right, you remember Terry Schiavo? This retro report the New York Times did. You can pause it here and watch this video. Really gets into just looking at what was going on in that particular case, right? It's from mid 2000s is when it was really salient. And there was a lot of things that were going on in that particular case. It was really complex. It really had to do with a fight between family members over what should be done with a woman who did not write down her wishes. Right, so she fell into a persistent vegetative state. Uh, Her family wanted to take care of her, but the husband said that she said to him privately that she didn't want to live that way. And so you can get into all of that stuff. But one of the things that was really difficult about that case publicly was whether withdrawing her feeding tube constituted an act of euthanasia. All right, people can get on board with withdrawing a ventilator. Ventilators are really burdensome to be on, by the way. Being intubated is a really unpleasant and terrible experience, right? A feeding tube, though, I mean, they have their own kind of problems. They can cause infections and this kind of stuff, but they're not as burdensome. And they're usually seen as just kind of providing, a basic need, food and water. And to take that away is to starve somebody, right? And so that's like some of the thought that went into the protests against removing her life-sustaining treatment, okay, is that they thought that this was going to be an act of euthanasia, all right? And so I just want you to think about that as we move through this text, all right? So just review a little bit of Cass. I won't get into all this, right? Obviously, he just thinks that no physician can benefit the patient, right, in the ways of healing or relieving suffering by taking out the patient, basically, right? Killing the patient is not going to be any kind of medical benefit at all, right? He thinks that this is outside of the goals of medicine. So we talked a little bit about that, all right? And Cass had some central claims here that we were thinking about, right? He really thought that the doctor-patient relationship would be damaged. It would undermine trust. He thinks that it would corrupt the physician's power over patients. He thinks that it was disrespectful to the personal embodiment that is found in human life, and he thinks that commands respect, right? It's not just some biological process. Human life is a good that is foundational to all other goods, right? And so he thinks it's on the same level as like autonomy, right? There's a reason why you can't sell yourself into slavery, right? Because of your autonomous choice, because it just undermines the whole good of autonomy. And to kill yourself, right, is to basically just do away with what you are, right? It's not some kind of curative act. Rather, it's just destructive. And so this is just seems to be somehow like it just undermines the good completely. It completely instrumentalizes it. All right. All right, and then of course, right, he thinks that it's important to push compassion, courage, and love, and help us people and assist them to live instead of assisting in dying. That's what medical professionals should be doing. Okay, anyway, so we talked about this, whether or not there's a broader view of medicine at play. I'm going to leave that aside and just try to get into our topic here. We have a lot to talk about today. Talk about a little about Daniel Brock. He is a well-known medical ethicist who is now retired. He was associated with Harvard's medical school. And, he's just one of these big shots from Harvard, right? Written tons and tons of papers. It's all over the place. So I don't know how anybody could accomplish all this in one career. But of course, people at Harvard are like this. So you can check him out. He is a famous euthanasia advocate. And the paper that I had you read is widely cited. It's usually one that you will find having great influence under euthanasia advocates today. The articles, the arguments that are mentioned often cite this article. All right. He's also a founding member of American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. Right, that's like a society that I'm a part of. Right, anybody who kind of does medical ethics is, and who wants to be like a professional in this, has got to be a part of this particular branch. It's it's like the American Philosophical Association, except it's for bioethics. All right. Like I said, he's a well-known euthanasia advocate, and he's a colleague of this very important physician that he mentioned in his paper named Timothy Quill. And Timothy Quill is the leading American physician who has advocated, death with dignity and really the push for legalizing assisted suicide in the United States. So he's been at the center of many court cases, and he was very, very active in this, especially in the 90s. I mean, he still publishes about this kind of stuff, but he's getting close to retirement now. But he has been really the guy who has made the case as persuasive as possible, all right? Especially in the 1990s, all right? And I'll get into more about why later on. And Brock is somebody who worked alongside with Timothy Quill and advanced what is called the bare difference argument for euthanasia. Now, if you're not familiar with that lingo, you should be. It got started here, but with this old paper by James Rachels. Remember how I mentioned James Rachels? It's called Active and Passive Euthanasia. It's only 3 pages long, and he just talks about how there's just very little difference between like withholding or withdrawing life support from somebody in order to kill them and giving them like a lethal injection in order to kill them, right? There's just no moral difference between these two things, right? And so he pushed this really hard because medical professionals, at the time and even still today, just really think, well, if I'm not doing anything, right, if I just withdraw life support and let the underlying disease take them, then the cause of death is their disease. It's not me, right? It's sometimes called like the act-omissions distinction. So actions, right, of killing are bad, but omissions, you know what? They're okay. And that's a really kind of simplistic way of spelling it out. But Rachels comes along and explodes that, right, with this paper. And he pushes what's called the bare difference argument, okay? And Brock expands upon this, right? He expands upon this, and he also advances this. And this is a very popular argument. This is advanced by other people who push for euthanasia, right? Michael Tooley is another one. But it's a very, very popular argument, and Brock's, of course, is just very articulate, which is why I had you read it. All right, so let's get into the right to refuse treatment, right, and its connection to euthanasia practices, right? Obviously, this is the U.S.'s background, but this is really, really important to understand because if you have the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment, right, you might think then, well, wait a second, don't I have a right to something else that might be lethal? Okay? All right. So this discussion really gets going. In part because of this film in 1971. It's called Who Should Survive? And I linked to it here. You should take the time to watch this. All right? This is somewhat disturbing, I will warn you. All right? What it did is it brought attention to practices that would happen in hospitals where an infant is born with Down syndrome who has like a gastrointestinal blockage. Okay? And this blockage is easily correctable, right? The surgery to do it is very simple. However, in order to do the surgery, at the time, you needed to have parental consent. Well, parents, not knowing, right, the condition that their baby had, right, there wasn't ultrasounds and prenatal testing back then, they would find out that they would have what was called a mongoloid baby, right? That was the term for a baby that has Down syndrome. And they would say, well, we don't want the surgery. Right, so they wouldn't consent to the surgery. So what ended up happening is that these babies then would die from dehydration. And they were very, very, just emotionally taxing cases, right? Doctors would plead with parents to correct the blockage, and they would say no. They didn't feel like they could force surgery upon the infant. They can do that now, right? That has changed. So if you're curious about that, parental consent now is limited on this, right? This has become kind of too horrifying of a practice. If if you've ever been around a newborn that's hungry, right, and you hear that kind of crying, uh, you know, this is what the medical staff would have to deal with, right? So this really becomes an issue. People start thinking of like, okay, like how much does this right, uh, does it extend to parents, right, about a disabled baby who doesn't, is not in the position to make a decision, okay? And so you get into like best interest standards, all right, and what we do. Okay, so you can kind of like, maybe you can like do some surgery and ignore parental consent here, okay? And you could say that the baby's abandoned at that point, and you would then put it out for adoption after it's given surgery. Okay, so there's those kinds of like issues that get raised. And then in 1973, there's the case of Dax, right? The case of Dax. Obviously, I've talked about this, I think, in earlier classes. This is a guy who was a burn victim, and he was just pleading with the paramedics, right, to not, like just take their time getting to the hospital. He wanted to die, right? He wanted to die, and treatment was forced upon him by his doctors, and they saved his life. He ended up living. He died like a couple years ago now, and he became a lawyer and a patient advocate and all this stuff. But he thought that, hey, you should not have forced treatment on me. I had the right to tell people how my life was going to go, what you're going to do to my body, okay? And so it's a very powerful story. You can read about all these things, right? I got wikis here, Dax cohort, you can check that out. And then there's the Quinlan case, 1975, right? Karen Ann Quinlan is a big deal, big case, right? She's this young woman who was on some kind of starvation diet and then consumed Valium along with alcohol, and then lapsed into a coma and then a vegetative state. And, the doctors, they didn't want her to withdraw life support. Okay. They wanted to keep her on life support. She was on like a ventilator. And so what ended up happening is they were able to get a court order, I believe, to remove the ventilator, and they did. And she kept breathing. She kept breathing for another like 10 years. And then she finally died. And her parents took care of her, right? They just kind of thought, look, what ended up being the case here is that the treatment, through the ventilator was considered to be burdensome. The old word was extraordinary. It was extraordinary measures, right? That's a term for burdensome treatment. And so they felt that that can be ended, but she ended up living. So they didn't like smother her with a pillow after that. They're like, oh, she's doing good. Take care of her. Okay. So that was like a seminal case, right? In the right to withdraw burdensome treatment, right? So that kind of corrects some of the things that happened here, right? Then there's the Bouvier case. The Bouvier case is 1986. This is the right to refuse water and food. I'm sorry, food and water, right? Otherwise known as artificial nutrition and hydration, or ANH. Okay, so that's what's going on up here. All right. Chivo was on that. Okay. Can you refuse that? Well, Bouvier was a mental patient, and she just wanted to die. She hated her life. And the mental health staff at her hospital said, too bad, you're going to eat anyway. And they forced fed her. Okay, and so there's a big court case about it, and she did not win. Okay, well, you can read about it here. It's kind of complicated, but the court did uphold the decision to force feed her. All right, and then when that got overturned, because they thought that what was happening to her was battery and torture. She just decided to kind of live. And she gets into this wiki gets into it all here. You can check it out. It's pretty interesting. All right. But that was over artificial nutrition and hydration. She ended up kind of winning the right to refuse it, but she then didn't exercise it. Okay. All right. And then Nancy Cruzan. This one went all the way to the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States. Right. Big landmark decision. right? This is really kind of the first right to die case ever heard. And basically what this means is that if somebody had clear and convincing evidence of a patient's wishes to remove life support, right, then they could do so, right? So she fell into a coma or something like this. You can read about the background, right? Another PVS patient, yeah, persistent vegetative state. She had a feeding tube, and then Missouri was like, well, I don't know if we can do that because she's got the right to life. And then the family was like, yeah, but she didn't want this. And so this is like a case that happened before Shivo, right? And so this was settled in the law, actually, that patients could do this if there was evidence that they wanted to have life support withdrawn. Okay, so that includes feeding tubes, right? The thing is, though, is in a dissent, I think it was close. It was like a 5-4 decision, and Justice Scalia had worried that if you were to allow people to plan through like an advance directive their own deaths, so if you fall into like a persistent vegetative state, you got an advance directive that says, we're without life support, I want to die in that kind of situation. He thinks that then would allow people to plan their own deaths, okay? And that's a right that the Constitution does not protect. Or so he said then, okay? So you can kind of see like the worries, like, oh, okay, so we can if we start, allowing people to like form intentions about their deaths, then this does not seem to be something the Constitution protects, even if it's just about withdrawing life support, okay? All right. So, 1991, the case of Diane is published in the New England Journal of Medicine, right? This is a big deal article. This is by Timothy Quill, right? I encourage you someday, if you'd like to read this. And it's really a game changer, right? It was controversial, but it just described his relationship with one of his patients who didn't want to pursue any more chemotherapy. She was a cancer patient. She sought out Timothy Quill for palliative care, and he helped her. He relieved her suffering through pain medication. But she finally just said, look, doc, what I'd like is some barbiturates. Can you give me a prescription to help me sleep? And he says, well, I can do that, but as you know, these things can be lethal. And she's like, mm-hmm. And, the understanding between them was that these are going to be available so that you can take them if you want to die. And he tells the whole story about that, okay? So that kind of case gets some traction. Brock writes this big article, all right, and the physician-assisted suicide movement really gets going. And the initial strategy was to go after laws that forbade that practice and say they're unconstitutional. Well, it didn't work out. Washington versus Glucksberg, the court ruled that the right to die or the right to be made dead is not a right that's protected by the Constitution. Okay, and so there's a long opinion about that. It's very interesting, very complicated. It gets into common law and what the right to life is supposed to mean in the U.S. So if you're really interested in that from a legal perspective, you got to read this. It's must reading if you're interested in how the law works with this. But they did leave it up to the states, and so states like Oregon in the wake of this constitutional ruling, then put in their state plans and say, well, it's legal. And so that's what you kind of see happening now. That's why we are where we're at, where states are like voting on it. All right, it can't be like federally mandated through the Supreme Court, like the way that abortion was. Right, the court took a different approach. They said, it's up to the states. They got to figure it out. Okay. All right, so we got through all the background finally. All right. So the main question then for us is that, look, if we can plan our deaths by means of withdrawing life support, okay, or life-sustaining treatment, that's what LST means here, then why can't we plan our deaths, that should be our, all right, by means of lethal injection or prescription, okay? That's going to be the main question. So that's where Brock starts. All right, and Brock's answer to that is just, but there's no morally relevant difference between withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and giving a lethal injection. Right, both acts are just acts of killing, straight up. All right. All right. So if that's the case, then giving a lethal injection, which is just is going to be a part of voluntary active euthanasia, right? That's going to be permissible under the same conditions that make withdrawing life-sustaining treatment permissible. Okay, so whatever conditions make withdrawing life-sustaining treatment are going to be ones that make euthanasia practices permissible. All right. So you just got to have the conditions right. You got to have like valid consent, right? You got to have kind of like somebody with capacity who's of sound mind. It has to accord with a certain kind of like understanding of their well-being, right? That the life that they're engaged in now is like burdensome, right? The burdens outweigh the benefits, and so under those kinds of conditions, right, where we allow people who are sick to withdraw life support, right? They don't want to be on a ventilator anymore. Then those kind of conditions will apply, and a doctor could give them a lethal injection, or they could take like a lethal cocktail of drugs or something like that. And the differences here are just minimal. Okay, that's Brock's overall argument. So central claims here, right? Like I said, no moral difference between physician-assisted suicide and voluntary active euthanasia. Oh yeah, right. In the beginning of the article, he says that there's some people who will go for this, but not this. They think there's like a big difference. He just thinks there just isn't one. All right. The doctor and patient are both working together to bring about the good of death. Right. So that is, bringing about a good death. Okay. He doesn't see any difference there. I don't know if you do. I certainly don't. But that's something we could discuss if you'd like. The same ethics that support the right to refuse treatment support the right to euthanasia practices. And so the two he mentions, right, and this is what Cass had talked about too in his paper, right? You have individual autonomy. We get to say in how our lives go, and then individual well-being. So death can be a benefit and life can be a burden. All right. And so if the burdens outweigh the benefits, well, there you go, right? There's like a rational process here that should be honored or respected. Okay. And so he thinks taken together, those values support a right to be made dead. Okay. You have a right to be made dead, or at least a right, and maybe it's like a permission right. You're permitted to be made dead. Okay. Maybe it's not such a strong right where someone else incurs a duty to make you dead. Brock actually stops short and he says, no, people like physicians can conscientiously object, right? Which is kind of interesting. That's actually very unpopular these days to make that kind of argument. People think that you can't consciously object to euthanizing patients, especially where it's legal. So if you're working like as a doctor in the Netherlands or Belgium and somebody asks you for euthanasia and you say, no, I don't do that, okay? You could be, your conscience claim could be treated as invalid, all right? At least those are arguments that are being made these days. But Brock back then, he's like, no, we want to have doctors have all the freedom in the world to not participate in this kind of stuff, okay? So that's kind of a change, right? That's a cultural change that we're going through. All right, so there is no more moral difference between killing and allowing to die. Right, so this is like this gets framed in the acts omissions doctrine, right? And the way the bare difference argument works is that it sort of says, well, here let's kind of hold everything constant. So like that's what Rachel's does. Like he has this like thought experiment about a greedy cousin drowning Charlie in a bathtub or whoever it is, right? And he kills him and tries to get inheritance money, right? The allowing the die thing, right? Same scenario. Guy comes in to drown Charlie, but Charlie has like bumped his head against the tub, falls face first into the water, and doesn't wake up and drowns. And the cousin is just sort of standing there gleefully watching this person die. Obviously, both of these people are morally monstrous. And so there's just no difference between these things, right? And so doctors who hide behind like the allowing to die category, they're just mistaken. They just don't seem to understand their actions, right? And the story that Brock tells, right, which has been repeated a lot in the literature, and this is one of the reasons why I had you read the paper, is that he compares the doctor treating like the ALS patient and then the greedy son, right, case. Okay, so the way that the story goes is, an ALS patient, expresses a wish to die, and the doctors, do an evaluation, and they think, okay, he's of sound mind, let's do this, and they honor his wish, and they extubate the patient, and he's no longer on the vents, and the person dies of respiratory complications. All right. You contrast that kind of case with the greedy son case, who sneaks into the room of the ALS patient and extubates the patient, or just turns off the ventilator. Let's say he just does that much, and of course, the ALS patient dies, and we would say, well, you're a murderer, right? You're a murderer. And the greedy son's like, I didn't kill him, right? Murder involves killing. I just allowed him to die. I did the same thing that the doctor did, right? I just pushed this button, let's say, right? Maybe I just pulled the plug. That's all I did, okay? The underlying condition took him out, not me. And that's just specious, right? We would all just say, well, no, you're morally monstrous, right? You're a killer, and so, we're going to punish you. But hey, here's the thing. If that defense doesn't work for the greedy son, then it doesn't work for the doctor either, right? And so basically what Brock has to say is that one kills when one causes death, right? One kills when one causes death, right? So appealing to like the underlying disease makes no difference at all, right? The reason why somebody is dead at the time that they're dead is because of you. And so that's that, all right? Now, obviously, the cases are morally different, right? In this case, you get consent, right? There's a kind of examination. It's from a good motivation, right? You're complying with the patient's wish, all right? Here, it's just all about money, right? And the guy's a real jerk. He doesn't even care about this person. And so you can say, yeah, that's, those are the things that make it different, right? But you can't say, right, that it's the action concepts are different. That's not the difference, all right? There's justified killing, right? And that's what's happening here for Brock. And then there's unjustified killing. That's what's happening here in the greedy son case for Brock, okay? He thinks that both the doctor and the greedy son act in a manner that's intended to cause death, all right? And that's important. You remember when we talked about double effect, right? See this idea that, an action can have different, cause different effects, all right? And so you might have a doctor who is maybe not wanting to withdraw life support. Maybe he thinks he could help the patient, but since the law says, well, you have to obey, the patient's request, right? There actually are laws like this in California, right? If you keep treating a patient against their will, you can be sued for assault and battery. And so you might then intend to like comply with the law, and then with that intention, foresee but not intend that the patient will die, right? And you might even lament that, okay? But you do it for like the proportional reason, to comply with the law, keep your medical license, and you might even really care about the value of autonomy, and so you're respecting that autonomy, even though you don't like it. Okay, so you can imagine a doctor like this. Brock says that's a bunch of hogwash. You're intending to cause death even if you don't think so, right? Right? That's just because that's what you're doing, right? You are causing death. And so that kind of action just necessarily means that you are intending death, okay? It's a really kind of interesting theory of action here in that what's going on mentally inside of you just doesn't seem to really matter. You're intending death if you're doing this. Okay, that's what he thinks. And you might think that that's pretty questionable theory of intention, but that's the kind of intention that Brock seems to want to push here. Okay? And so therefore he thinks that both of these people are killing, right? The doctor and the greedy son. They're both killing, but one's killing in a good way and the other one's killing in a bad way. Now, what makes killing wrong for Brock is that it deprives someone of a, it should be this should say a valued future. Okay, that's what he says in the paper. And so if the person values their future and you deprive them of it, then you wrong them, okay? When you do something wrong. And you're also like depriving them of all that the person wanted and planned to do. All right, so I think he says that here on page. Where is that? I'm looking for it here. Yeah, on page 14, middle paragraph. Right. In a nutshell, wrongful killing deprives person of. Oh, it's a valued future. Okay, I was right to correct that. Good. All right. So that the person is innocent makes no secular difference, right? So it might make a difference to you if you're like a believer, right? There are rules in the Bible, right, that forbid taking innocent human life, okay? But, you're not formulating public policy on religious texts, and so looking for secular reasons here, this doesn't make a difference, okay? The right to life view, right? You violate the right to life if you take someone's life. Okay, that's a way of understanding the wrongness of killing. That view assumes that the right to life is not waivable. Okay, so remember like the little story I told about, the right of autonomy? Okay, autonomy is not something you can waive. You can't like autonomously choose to become a slave, right? Because that undermines the good of autonomy in a self-defeating way, all right? So the idea there is that the right to autonomous choice is not waivable. You can't just make yourself a slave, okay? And Brock says, yeah, I can agree with that, but then to say that the right to life is not waivable, I don't know. Actually, I think you could probably look at your life like property or something like that. Property is something that you can waive your right to. I don't want that anymore, right? We're going to be moving in a month here, and we're gonna throw some of our stuff right on the side of the curb and put a sign that says free. All right, we can waive our right to that property. And so he thinks, look, to just assume that it's not waivable is question begging. Okay, he thinks that's question begging. He doesn't give an argument for why it is waivable, but he just thinks that people like Cass and other sanctity of life advocates who assume it's not waivable are begging the question. All right. Now, the lengthiest part of the paper is his argument about consequences. And I'm not going to get into this too deeply here, all right? But the main point that he makes throughout the article is this, is that arguments for bad consequences are going to be empirically determined. So we have to do some investigation first. We can't just assume, things are going to turn out bad. And we might have some evidence for thinking they won't turn out bad because none of the bad consequences that he talks about have followed from allowing people to refuse life-sustaining treatment, right? Which, of course, he thinks is morally equivalent with euthanasia practices, right? So he doesn't think that they have undermined the physician's role as healer, right? There are broader goals of medicine than Cass allows. He doesn't say what they are in this article, so that's something that we could talk about. He has not weakened our. He says it's not weakened our commitment to the care for the dying, right? We don't make the dying worse off, right? By forcing them to rationally justify their life choice. Like, this just doesn't do these kinds of things, he thinks, right? This doesn't do these kind of things, he thinks. It hasn't weakened our prohibition against homicide. Now, he does worry about the slippery slope a bit, right? He does think that good regulation is possible, right? Okay. All right, so some discussion questions here. Do you agree? Do you believe that the right to refuse treatment and the right to euthanasia are equally secure? Okay, that's what Brock thinks, but our legal tradition does not. Now, I didn't have you read any of the legal pieces, right? We could just say that our legal tradition assumes that, right? Or you could do some investigation if you wanted. I'll leave that up to you. But this is a discussion question I want you to answer. And then going back to the doctor versus greedy son case, let me ask you this, right? Does the fact that the doctor initially provides life support for the patient, whereas the son does not, right? Does that make a difference to the concept? Like I'm asking about the action concept of the doctor's action, right? That is to say, is it better understood as allowing to die rather than killing? Okay, so you might actually think that, no, this is what the doctor's doing is better described as allowing to die, right, rather than just being a killing, because of like this involvement with providing life support. Okay, the remover-provider distinction is what it's called, right? Then I want you to also answer this question: does that make a moral difference? Right? Yeah, maybe you can describe it as allowing to die, right? Fair enough. But does that make a moral difference? Okay, why or why not? Okay, 3. If the wrongness of killing is a matter of depriving someone of a valued future, and if patient autonomy and welfare considerations are the only values that constrain a physician's license to kill, then should physicians assist in making dead non-terminal patients? Right? And the people I have in mind here are like these twins, right? In Belgium. They were both deaf and they were both going blind, and they didn't want to live without each other, and so they were euthanized together. Okay, you can read about that story, all right? Or you might think about people who don't like the way their lives turn out. This is another case from Belgium, right? This person chose euthanasia after what they consider to be a failed gender reassignment surgery. Right? The person was disgusted with themselves. They felt like a monster. It was just my new breast did not match my expectations. Right? My penis had symptoms of rejection, and so I think it's I'm not. The reason I haven't used the name is I don't know how to pronounce it. Versthelst applied for euthanasia and got it. Okay, and so look, right? If these are the controlling values, right? Then what could be wrong with this, right? Right? Tell me about that. Tell me about what you think, right? So that is what I have for today's lecture, right? I know that was a lot. There's a lot of other things we can talk about here too. And, I really should add good old question 4 here. What questions do you want to talk about? All right, so that is today's lecture. And if you have any questions or concerns, just shoot me an email. We can chat over Zoom. And I will talk to you later.